Tonight, we're going to talk about ethics in research, and in particular in research, usually of a medical or just scientific nature, that involves studying things on humans. So, whether it's treatments or whatever else it is. Unfortunately, this is a topic where we could talk about almost endless examples. And it's something that you can study really throughout the history of science and the history of medicine. But I'm going to focus on a handful of examples, and I'll kind of talk about the ethical stuff mostly toward the end of the lecture, but I did definitely want to give some tangible examples so that we can think about them going forward. One of the first examples that we should probably talk about are the Nazis. So in 1940s Germany, the Nazis did a lot of really unethical and just inhumane experiments on prisoners in the camps. Okay, so this bottom left-hand picture is a crop of a very large pile of just the glasses that the prisoners wore in Auschwitz. So, just tons of people were taken to these camps and killed. Given that the alternative was being worked to death or being systematically annihilated, sometimes people found it as a bit of a blessing to take part in some of these research studies. And so I'm not saying that that's good. I'm just saying that sometimes prisoners view that like that. And one of the monsters of the Nazi Party is this doctor and experimenter, Josef Mengele. He's probably the most infamous one. A lot has been written about him. You could Google his name and find all sorts of details. But he and similar doctors, they did things like infect prisoners with cholera and smallpox, typhus, malaria, all types of other things. They injected them with poison just to see what happened, to see what the exact effects were, how long the poison took to take effect, all those types of things. They shot them to simulate battle wounds and see what would happen. Froze them to death, they starved them to death, they just sterilized and mutilated and basically did whatever they wanted. He's probably most infamous for twin studies. So Mengele had a penchant for all sorts of different people. He in particular focused on things that were outside of basically average human nature. For example, he had a thing for trying to find little people, so he did experiments on them. But he also tried to get as many twins as he could. So if you think about the structure of an experiment, what you try to do is you set up an experimental variable and something like a control group. So you keep the control the same and you compare it to what you're doing in the experimental group. Twins provided this opportunity for him. And he was this very strange, some people described it as Jekyll and Hyde personality, where on the one hand, he would get the trust of little kids or of people and remember details about their day. Maybe he'd save sweets or extra rations for the prisoners that he was trying to take care of. And if you were a part of his experiment, it might be the case that he would make sure that you're fed and clothed and receiving at least a little bit of treatment so that, of course, he can conduct his experiments. But then maybe on the very next day, despite the fact that he knew these people and tried to look after them in certain ways, he would send them to a gas chamber or to a crematorium. So a very cold, calculated guy, and probably the most monstrous person in a lot of these things. A lot of Jewish survivors of the death camps and other survivors really wanted him to be prosecuted for his crimes against humanity. But it's pretty much agreed that he did run away to South America and fled most authorities and then just basically died. So there wasn't really that much of a resolution to Mengele. He did all of these awful things. Then he fled Germany and basically met a death later on. I wanted to also just, mention a couple of other people because it's not just Mengele. There were a lot of Nazi doctors that did these types of things. And I wanted to mention in particular Karl Klauberg and Horst Schumann. And this is, so if you watched the ethics of human enhancement, a lot of eugenics programs got a bad reputation from the Nazis because the Nazis were literally trying to sterilize and exterminate people against their wills. right? And so Klauberg and Schumann were kind of at the center of this, Himmler as well. So you could imagine whenever the Nazis were trying to create the master race, one of the ways that they wanted to do that was to try and find ways to prevent people from breeding. So experimentation with radiation and those types of things were kind of happening. And I wanted to read you this about some experiments with Klauberg and Schumann. Okay, so this is from Robert Lifton's Nazi Doctors. This is a tome of a book, details everything in, really, really stark detail. If you're interested in the subject, I would totally recommend this book. But here's an excerpt. Dr. Eric G. told of the psychological pain and experimental victims and of their questions to him. Quote, "Will I be able to be a father? Can I have relations with females?" So these are reflections on people who are being experimented on for these forced sterilization experiments. But admitted that at the time, that was not the greatest emotional stress. This is a quote from a survivor. "To survive was more important than to be mutilated or even castrated." So again, they are afraid of really terrible things, so they take part in these studies. And the fear was that experimental victims would be killed. Schumann's callousness was reflected in, quote, "the little device," end quote, that he constructed to insert into the rectum to stimulate the prostate and produce ejaculation, which was, quote, "painful and humiliating, so that the patient suffered a great deal," end quote. It also produced, quote, "terrible infections. For Schumann, it was nothing. He was testing the results of his work." One of the male victims told of the sequence from the X-rays, quote, "My genital organ, together with the scrotum on a machine, the noise of a motor from 5 to 8 minutes, after which he had a general ill feeling, to the collection of sperm, quote, Dr. Daring came with a sort of club and put it into my rectum. Some drops came out of my member," end quote. To beginning arrangements for the operation, quote, "I said, why are you operating on me? I am not sick." And Daring answered, "If I take not the testicle off you, they will take it off me," end quote. To the painful spinal anesthetic and operation itself. Quote, "After some minutes, I saw Dr. Daring when he had my testicle in his hand and showed it to Dr. Schumann, who was present," end quote. To another man asking the same question before the operation, Daring replied, quote, "Stop barking like a dog. You will die anyway," end quote. So I just share that because it gives some of the details of these experiments. These experiments were not done humanely, obviously. It's kind of questionable what you can learn from such harsh conditions. And they were doing things so that they could carry out the Nazi objectives, right? Whenever people talk about things like forced sterilization or eugenics or violations of any sort of ethical code, the Nazis come up a lot, and for very good reason. So I just wanted to share some of that with you so that you kind of understand why they come up so often in this subject. But this wasn't constrained just to Germany. And so I think it's really, really important to show that it happens in a lot of different countries. And so we think of Sweden, for example, as this liberal utopia, social democratic socialist or democratic socialist utopia with all sorts of rights and stuff like that. But in the 1940s, they were doing these things called the Vipeholm experiments. And just outside of Lund, Sweden, there was this institution called the Vipeholm Mental Institution. And basically what they did was they wanted to research tooth decay. And what they did was they took these people with very, very low IQs, many with different intellectual and mental disabilities. And for a couple of years, they made sure to give them vitamins and fluoride tablets and basically fed them a low-starch diet and made sure that they didn't snack between meals. And they observed their teeth and they found that a really large majority basically had no cavities. But then to confirm that sugar might be the cause of tooth decay, because they didn't really know for sure, I mean, they had a hint, right? So whenever they studied tooth decay, they found that really poor people didn't have much tooth decay, and the hypothesis was it was because they didn't have any extra money for sweets or lots of extra starchy, sugary foods, right? So they suspected that it was sugar. How did they figure out whether it was sugar? Well, after the 2 years of observation, making sure that people have fluoride and nutritious diets, etc., they took these same people with mental disabilities and they gave them double the amount of sugar that most Swedish people have. They got some groups to drink sugary drinks and eat toffee that was designed to stick to the teeth. And after they did this, they viewed the teeth, and that's what this right-hand picture is, and they found that there was extensive decay in their mouths. Okay. And whenever the doctors and the experimenters were interviewed, many of them very straightforwardly said, look, these people with such low IQs, say an IQ of 20, they are less sophisticated maybe than a toddler, and they don't have the worth of a normal human being. They have the worth of an animal or maybe even less. Okay. There's a very callous attitude that happens in a lot of these experiments where dehumanization takes place. And I don't think I really need to spend too much more time talking about this, but this one doesn't get as much press, and I think it's just as important to talk about. So I've talked about Germany, I've talked about Sweden. What about the United States? So perhaps the most infamous case of abuse in research happened in Tuskegee around their syphilis experiments. Okay, and in the book, we have a succinct account by Allan Brandt. Basically, this experiment or this study started in 1932, and it happened with the cooperation of the university in Tuskegee, as well as the U.S. Public Health Service. Okay, so it's fairly controversial. Some people still want to say that this isn't a racist experiment. I, however, think that it is, and I'll kind of explain why I think that's the case. But basically, the goal of this experiment was to try to find out what untreated syphilis does. Okay, and the original experimenters kind of wanted to call this a, quote, study in nature, or basically an observation. That's not entirely true, though, because they did give extensive physical evaluations and diagnoses to the people, so it wasn't even really a study in nature. I mean, I'm trying to think about what legitimate purposes this could have served. I don't really know, because this was a disease that was known even in like the 1800s, and there were not very effective treatments, but there were treatments. And a lot of people agreed that you should give treatments for these types of things to try and avoid the harshest brain damage and, lesions that would lead to death from syphilis. So I really don't know. Maybe it's just my benefit of me being now, but it's not really clear even going in what they were trying to get out of this experiment. So basically, they found 400 men with syphilis, and they found 200 healthy men as a control, and they were given pretty extensive physicals and x-rays and spinal taps just to confirm that they had syphilis, or how extensive it was, right? But they were given no treatment, right? They weren't even given treatment after the 1950s, when penicillin became widely available and very effective at treating syphilis. It's even the case that throughout the 1890s up to the 1930s, there was lots of medical documents and scientific documents recommending different treatments. They ignored those as well. So I think that this experiment, again, is kind of showing that there's historical precedent or treatments that were even ignored in this particular case. So they found all of these subjects largely between the ages of 25 and 60. And there's just myriad violations here. One is that they intentionally recruited people from Macon County because it had, quote, the highest rate of syphilis among the 6 counties surveyed. But even so, whenever they did that, they actually found that the rate of infection was much lower than their actual estimates. So this is where the racism starts to crop in. They thought that Black folk in the South were recalcitrant to medical medical treatment and wouldn't seek treatment and stuff like that, or that they were dirty and diseased. And they found empirically that that just was not the case. And the people that they tried to recruit into the study were largely illiterate, and they were largely impoverished, and they came from a population of sharecroppers and tenant farmers. So again, there's an element of exploitation here that's very tough to ignore, I think. And they actually had a hard time finding subjects. So again, this had to deal with the rate of infection being much lower. So it was around 20% of the people that they tested who had it, which was up from their estimates of 35%. And also they had a hard time finding people who hadn't sought much treatment before. So what they found was that a lot of people didn't like having syphilis, or it was also known as bad blood, and they tried to find treatments for it. So after they sorted this out, right, they kind of preyed on poor and impoverished people. They found men who nonetheless were still willing to participate, and they told them, look, you're ill, you have bad blood, aka syphilis, and we would like to give you treatment for free, right? So they lied to them. They outright lied to them. Maybe they did have syphilis, that was true, but they said that they were going to have treatment, and they actually didn't do that at all. They were not told that they were going to be subjects in an experiment, and they were given known to be ineffective treatments, okay? And not only did they give them ineffective treatments just to observe them to see what syphilis did to them, they also prevented them from seeking treatments elsewhere, all right? And they found that, the men were really eager to cooperate. They wanted to get better, and they wanted to sort of be open and compliant with the doctors to help them out. But this, again, undermined a lot of the stereotypes that people wouldn't seek or continue therapy. So this is, I think to me, very overt cases of racism. The ill stereotypes and expectations that white doctors and people who were educated and learned had of these people who lived in the rural South. So this experiment went on for 40 years. 40 years, okay? And it basically stopped in 1972 after a lot of the documents of this experiment got exposed, and the press took it, and they were really, really alarmed, and they finally created enough public pressure to get these studies shut down. All right. And in fact, in 1969, so we're talking, toward the end of the experiment anyway, and long after penicillin had been shown to be effective and it was accessible, there actually was a group of physicians that met at the CDC to decide, whether to end the study. But on the panel of physicians, and I'm not sure the exact number, but it was a fair number of physicians, and only one said that they should stop the experiment. Of course, this physician was ignored, and they continued with the experiment. They found that roughly 28 to 100, depending on, how you read the records, 28 to 100 people died directly from the syphilitic lesions that were untreated in these experiments. Okay. So I want to spend a little bit of time just kind of making these points very, very clear. The Tuskegee syphilis study, in addition to just being racist, it also violated the basic rule of human experimentation, which is that subjects must provide voluntary informed consent. Voluntary informed consent. That is super crucial. No participant entered voluntarily because they basically had to be deceived to take place in the experiment, right? And they were told that they were being treated, but they weren't actually. And they were prevented from seeking treatment elsewhere. So there's nothing voluntary about this. They were basically lied to and exploited in order to get that. Moreover, the fact that they recruited from an illiterate and highly impoverished population kind of shows the ways in which physicians and scientists are able to take advantage of people. So the voluntariness is completely gone. And the fact that they were deceived about their treatments or what was going on in the experiment definitely takes away the informed aspect of voluntary informed consent. Okay? Weren't told they were an experiment, right? And they weren't even really given info about their illness and the treatments that they were undergoing. So no way that you look at this can really find that there's any clinical or scientific use for this experiment. Maybe you can find some sort of way of justifying it in its early stages. But as soon as penicillin was known and it was accessible in the 1950s, this experiment should have stopped. It went on for 20 more years. 20 more years of deception, 20 more years of overt exploitation of the people who were in this experiment. All right. And in particular, this raises a lot of questions about the self-regulation of medicine and science, of what it does. Because like I was saying, the biggest panel happened in 1969, almost 40 years after the start of this experiment. And the one dissenting voice that told them, hey, we shouldn't be doing this, was basically ignored. The only reason that this experiment stopped was because the popular press found ways of putting it in popular channels. People read about it and were horrified. Okay? So this also shows that people, scientists and doctors included, people who took oaths to heal people, are not above racism. They're not above trying to just accomplish whatever they want to accomplish on their own means and openly exploiting vulnerable populations. So that's basically why the Tuskegee syphilis study or experiment, it's basically the most infamous thing as far as medical research happening in America, and it's a very, very painful aspect of racism in America. Now, maybe I'll go back a slide really quickly. No, I'll leave it here. I want to emphasize that these things basically haven't stopped. Okay, maybe they've become less obvious and less egregious to a certain extent, but they haven't stopped by any means. So, for example, I got my PhD at Vanderbilt. It's a reputable school, and in fact, like its medical school is very, very well regarded. I was not a medical student. I'm the useless kind of doctor. And in the 1990s, so in 1996, in Kraft v. Vanderbilt, basically Vanderbilt, along with the Rockefeller Foundation and the state of Tennessee, they were all implicated in this lawsuit. And plaintiffs alleged that in the 1940s, a group of pregnant women didn't grant voluntary or informed consent to participate in a study. Basically, they were told, these pregnant women, that they were going to participate in a study on the absorption of iron in pregnant women. So anemia can be fairly prominent in women, right? And in women who are gestating a fetus. But they were never told that the iron that they were using to test how it was being absorbed was radioactive. All right? And Vanderbilt and the scientific community knew that radioactive things had ill effects. It was kind of a new science, but people knew the effects of radiation in the 1940s. And what's even crazier about this was they weren't told that they were being injected with radiated iron, but they also were not told that there were any ill effects of what was going on. So they weren't told about anything. Vanderbilt even did a follow-up studies in the 1960s, and the plaintiffs alleged that they weren't told, even at this follow-up study, that they were exposed to radiation. And the follow-ups even showed that the participants in the studies had higher incidences of cancer than the general population. So this lawsuit that happened at Vanderbilt happened because pregnant women were injected with radioactive material and not told the details of the study. So informed consent, nope. Voluntary? Nope, because they were lied to. Eventually, as far as I know, it was settled out of court, I think for something like $10 million. All right. But we don't even have to go back to 1996. Also in the 90s and even the 2000s, and I'm sure there's still versions of this going on. This is an example that came in our book. This was reported on by Nina Bernstein in an article called Strings Attached in the New York Times in 1999. And she basically wrote an article criticizing some HIV studies in Haiti by the Weill Cornell Medical College. Okay. And so this is a picture of their building in New York City. And this is a group of physicians all in the Weill Cornell Medical Center. And the yellow arrow is Dr. Warren Johnson. He's the director of the Weill Cornell Medical College Center for Global Health. So he knows what's going on in these experiments. And then this is Dr. Jean Pop. And Jean Pop is from Haiti. So he's like a native of the place where they're studying. And he also was a graduate of Weill Cornell and a very respected, renowned doctor. And he's done a lot of work for the study of HIV in various populations. So, I'm not trying to throw too much shade to these guys, but I am saying they know the details of this. And this is why the textbook tries to use this example, because it is a case of Cornell, which has billions of dollars. Top class physicians come out of this college, and they're sponsoring research doing this particular thing. Okay, so what is the experiment? The experiment is basically that there's an AIDS clinic run by Cornell that provides treatment to the people in Haiti for AIDS. Now, it is some of the best treatment that you can get in the country. And it's a country where AIDS and HIV have wreaked havoc, right? And they're providing this kind of treatment to the citizens for free. But the big ethical problem comes in the fact that the ethical treatment that they provide them is not on par with what similar people, so with AIDS or HIV positive status, would receive in the United States. All right. So at the time of this article being written in 1999, there were 15 years of records that basically showed that there had been little oversight and little criticism of the way that the studies were happening in Haiti. Okay, I still haven't really talked about the experiments or what's going on. Basically, what they tried to do is they tried to find couples, and couples in particular where one partner was HIV positive and the other partner was not. And they knew that through repeated exposure to their partner, and they knew that the rate of compliance of using condoms in Haiti was very, very low, that these partners who did not have HIV were going to be exposed to the virus. And what they wanted to do, and this is what was put in their consent forms, was study their blood because they knew that they were in a region with a high amount of HIV and AIDS, right? So they weren't told that they were in a study about couples where one is positive and one is negative. They're just basically told, we want to study your blood. And the idea is that they're trying to find some sort of vaccine or a cure for AIDS. So if there is a subset of the population that just has some sort of natural immunity, right, to AIDS, that would be huge. AIDS is a really, really big problem. And so the physicians were trying to find, is there something about these people who are in the relationships with people who are HIV positive that could lead to something like a cure? That could help millions and millions of people, right? But despite the fact that Cornell and the federal government were kind of involved in these studies, and despite the fact that these people have training at some of the top tier institutions in the world, they were still only providing a certain low bar of medical treatment by standards in the US. Again, this is sponsored by Cornell. And basically the defense that they offered, so Dr. Pop, whenever he talks about this, says that it'd be unethical to offer life-saving drugs to only a handful of research participants. So he's worried about the distribution of certain types of resources. And he says that basically, if they did what was perfectly ethical in this case, and give HIV treatment to everyone, that just doing that would be spending 10 times the budget that Haiti spends on health. And he says, look, this isn't perfect, but at the center where they're treating people in Haiti, they have access to condoms, they have access to counseling, they have access to all the other free services that other people can get access to, right? Side note, it doesn't really seem as though they're encouraging compliance in these types of things, but that is not really clear. So whenever this study was kind of criticized, especially in the New York Times, there were a lot of different criticisms of this. First of all, this is a life or death situation. It's not like being HIV positive and developing AIDS is something that's just a minor inconvenience. This is something that can dramatically affect your life and potentially even make it such that things can kill you very easily, right? And not only that, but it's a contagious disease that has public health implications. So, they aren't being open about that. It's a fatal disease potentially, and it's something that can affect a bunch of other people. And so this is the sticking point as well. It would be unacceptable of a clinic to do this same sort of study in the United States. But just because these people are in Haiti, and just because there's a low standard of care there, it seems as though Cornell University and their medical college can go into a country like that and provide substandard care by American standards in order to do these types of things. Right? That's going to be the big moment of controversy. We'll come back to this a little bit later. But for example, the Declaration of Helsinki, which is one of the documents that was written to try and standardize ethical things to do and to avoid in human experimentation, says that people or participants in studies should be given the best standard of care. Not best for the local economy or the local society, or not average and what people generally get, the best available. That is not what's happening in these Haiti studies, all right? And so I wanted to bring that up because whenever we think about abuses of human people, we think Nazis, we think the Tuskegee syphilis study. We don't think of other countries, so Sweden, and we don't think of contemporary America, even though there are very many ethically gray, and I would say unethical in this case, experiments. And that's just my personal opinion on this sort of thing that happen. If these types of things were happening in America, the patients would basically be absolutely encouraged to use condoms. They would be given antiretrovirals. And in fact, pre-exposure prophylaxis, if you yourself are sexually active with any sort of at-risk population, you can talk to your doctor about PrEP or pre-exposure prophylaxis to try and mitigate your chances of getting HIV, and which turns into AIDS, right? That's not what's happening in Haiti. And the question is that ethical or not? All right. But in the news, and I don't know if you saw this, and the doctors since have apologized for this, there were actually contemporary examples. So this month, a couple of doctors who were talking on a French television show, so Jean-Paul Mirat and Dr. Camille Lacht, they basically said that whenever they're trying to figure out whether there are treatments on COVID-19 or, any sort of vaccines that could be tested, they recommended testing them in Africa, right? And so Mirat said, and this is a translation, if I could be provocative, should we not do this study in Africa where there are no masks, treatment, or intensive care? A little bit like it's done, by the way, for certain AIDS studies or with prostitutes. So, referencing the stuff like the Haiti stuff. We try things because we know they are highly exposed and they don't protect themselves, end quote. And then Camille Lacht, he said, basically, yeah, you're right. And by the way, we are in the process of thinking in parallel about a study in Africa. That doesn't prevent us in parallel from also thinking about a study in Europe or Australia. So, two highly educated people from a liberal country like France still wanting to do this thing like study these treatments and vaccines in Africa. And So a lot of people point out rightly, this is part of the colonialist mindset, right? Where you can just treat other people like something to be experimented. They're treated like objects. There's an element of dehumanization here. And it's not even clear if you did develop the treatment or develop the vaccine, whether the people in Africa who are being experimented on would get it, right? So even if there were goods, how are those goods being distributed? Are they given just to the French people or people in Europe or people in large economies that can pay for it? And so this, like, I know that sometimes this comes off as like very subtle, or ways in which people think that, you know, someone like me is just being like a social justice warrior or, you know, politically correct or way too sensitive. But that's not the case at all. This is life or death. This is stuff that has huge implications. And it's very much the case that if we study history carefully, we can completely see that people who are vulnerable or people who are not from the United States can be exploited in various ways. So we thought that this was a thing of the past, or at least some people did. I'm saying not the case. These standards for ethics of how we research human beings, they need to be upheld today because a lot of people roughly do not follow these guidelines. All right, so I want to talk about Marcia Angell. She is a physician, and in fact, she's a total badass. She was the first woman to serve as the editor-in-chief of the New England Journal of Medicine, and she's faculty at Harvard. So she knows her stuff, all right? And why I chose for y'all to read her article is because basically she's going to say, look, no matter what we're doing, we need to make sure that the well-being of our participants, the people in the studies, is always, always taken as more important than the goals of the research. And in particular, she's going to say, look, informed consent, that's great. We should totally do that. That is an ethical minimum standard, but it's not good enough. We need to do more, such as, for example, upholding elements of the Declaration of Helsinki, such as making sure that there is no known better treatment than the participants are receiving. So the participants have to receive the best known medical treatment, right? So she in particular makes a technical point about double-blind, placebo-controlled randomized trials, okay? And I know that's a lot of jargon, and let me break it down for you. So double-blind means that basically you have a group of participants and the scientists or the people who are running the experiments or running the analyses, they don't know who is in which group, okay? And the different groups, so potentially the two groups, one group is given an experimental drug, the other group is given something like a drug that has no effect or maybe a sugar pill or something like that. They're given the placebo. Why would you do that? Well, you're trying to make sure that there aren't any unknown variables. You're trying to keep the study as simple as possible. So if you know that one group has the placebo, they have something that is inert or not doing anything, then, and if the other group shows improvement in the treatment or in the disease because of the treatment, you can fairly easily show that that's because of what you did in that particular experiment. Okay, so the double-blind, placebo-controlled, and randomized trials are kind of taken as the pinnacle of research in a lot of ways. But she's going to say you can only do that in cases where effective treatments are not already known. So I should have a not there. I apologize for that typo. So it's only the case where there is no effective treatment that you are ethically justified in doing this. Because if the standard is making sure that they're getting the best known treatment, and there is no best known treatment, then okay, give them a placebo, right? But that's very often not the case. And she's going to say, in particular, you know, speaking as someone who was the editor-in-chief at the New England Journal of Medicine, which is like one of the top-tier journals in medicine, she's going to say, look, journals aren't draconian about this anymore. And in fact, she says, the New England Journal of Medicine explicitly states that they do not want to publish anything that's scientifically neat, but ethically flawed. Okay? Because it's bad for the scientific community, it's bad for the medical community, and if you are a member of any sort of marginalized or exploited population, historically speaking, how the hell are you going to trust any doctor or any public health authority to do the right thing if time and time again it's shown that you are taken advantage of, right? So a lot of people, in particular, like Dr. Angell here, she's going to basically say, we can't do this. Journals don't hold this double-blind, placebo-controlled, randomized trial as the only effective way of setting up an experiment. She knows because she was the editor-in-chief. And moreover, you need to make sure that the well-being of people is taken care of, and it has much better social effects than not. And she's going to say, part of the problem is that it's big business to conduct these clinical trials. And whenever you have money involved because of how much money it takes to run these trials, they demand fast work. They demand work with a minimum number of obstacles. And so you just want things to happen as fast and as, efficiently as possible. But she's going to say, look, we shouldn't be swayed by this. And instead, we should try to hold the best ethical standards that we can. All right. It's not about saving money. It's not about scientific rigor. It's about the fact that you are involving human beings, and these human beings deserve the best standard of care that you can give them. And that is sort of the ethical bottom line. You always prize the well-being of the participants more than the goals of the research. This is what Dr. Angell is going to recommend. So it's a fairly short article. The thesis isn't that complicated, but I think that it's also really important to emphasize. So I want to just take a step back. We've talked about a lot of cases. We've talked about a couple of different people and what they think about these experiments. And I want to just highlight a lot of the values that we've talked about in the semester so far. One way that you can look at one of the fundamental conflicts in these studies is that there's something like the utility of research or knowledge that's conflicting with the autonomy of the participants, okay? Or at least this is how sometimes it's discussed in literature. So if you're looking for something like the cure to AIDS, there is a lot of bad that you can prevent in the world by having the cure to AIDS, and there is a lot of good that you can actively do for patients who already have that. Right? So there are huge, huge implications if what you're trying to do is maximize or promote the good or avoid the bad, aka utility. There's a lot of good that can come out of research and knowledge. So you don't want to deny that, right? But on the other hand, there's a way in which you can't do exactly what you want in scientific or medical research by giving patients all of the knowledge they should have, right? So if you tell the patient, look, you're not receiving the experimental treatment, there's a way in which something can happen that's called the nocebo effect. So the placebo effect is the idea that someone could give you something like a sugar pill and say that it's a cure for something. And because you believe that it's the case, you actually start to feel better. That's placebo effect. But the opposite also holds sometimes, the nocebo effect, which is sometimes you can give someone a clinically proven effective thing to treat an illness, but if you tell them it is not the effective thing, then it doesn't have the effect because of the mindset or whatever, complex causal mechanism is going on. So there's a way in which what you're telling the participants may affect what you're doing in the research. And certainly it's going to cost money. It's going to take time to do things above board. So it seems as though there's a conflict between autonomy of the participants, where you have to provide as much information as possible, voluntary informed consent. Voluntary, they're not being deceived. They're not being exploited, right? They could reasonably say no. Some people are even going to say you shouldn't test participants who don't have the ability to get medical treatment any other way. So for example, if a participant, this is their only chance at being treated for this particular illness because they don't have the economic or social means to get treatment elsewhere, they're going to say, yeah, that doesn't seem so voluntary to me. That seems like they're being forced into participating into this study because of circumstances, right? So I'm not going to tell you what the bar is for autonomy. I'm just trying to highlight that voluntary informed consent and the informed element, not only should you tell them that they're taking place in a research, but you should also tell them what the risks and the benefits are of the particular treatments that are going on in the study. But that is opposed potentially to the utility of the research and the knowledge, right? So I wanted to bring that up because you'll see these types of things brought up in the literature quite often. And now I just want to spend some time talking about the 4 principles, right? Autonomy, we talked about voluntary informed consent already. Justice. So justice is a huge element here, especially for things like public health. And we can think about just a broad definition of justice as the distribution of benefits and burdens in society, right? And so in these cases, the benefits obviously are the treatment, and the burdens are access to the treatments and the risks of the research. Who is getting the treatment? Who has access to the proven ones, right? What are the risks? So part of what makes Tuskegee or potentially the Haiti experiments so bad is that these marginalized populations are only bearing the burdens of the scientific research. They're exposed to a lot of risk. They're not given treatment that is adequate of the host research institutions. And who gets the benefits? It's the rich countries, or it's the rich populations, right? And that in itself is a deeply unjust thing to do. So again, justice is one of these operative principles in elements of human research. Non-maleficence, we already kind of talked about, but scientific and medical pressure to stop a disease. But I think that there's also an element here of we should probably also try to avoid exploitation, and not just, that's an understatement. We should avoid exploitation, especially of vulnerable people, right? Why aren't scientists worried about this as much as the disease? The effects of exploiting a population and eroding trust in the institution of medicine, they're really, really huge. And if you're really concerned about avoiding the most harm or preventing harm from illness or distress or disease, you also have to take into consideration the complex social causes of things like exploitation, oppression, racism, sexism, whatever else it is, and the ways in which medicine and society overall are harmed if the educated and healers or, healing people of our society are also doing these things to certain populations. And then the last one is beneficence. So if you're actively trying to do good, there's a scientific and medical hope to find cures and provide them. And that's sort of a given. But these things are really, really complex, and they are ways in which, we have to consider all of the far-ranging effects of these experiments. And we really need to place a lot of pressure on institutions to make sure that they're doing things that are above board. Now, typically, there are safeguards in place, but I'm going to talk a little bit about those with the next slide. So another book that we could have easily read is a book by Harriet Washington called Medical Apartheid. And so she in particular looks at the ways in which medicine and science has used Black Americans to further scientific and medical agendas. And so in addition to just providing a ton of detail and a lot of academic talk about what's going on, she ends the book with basically advice on what we can do to avoid some of the bad problems that are popping up. Okay. So like I was saying, look, there are safeguards in place. All right. One of the safeguards that institutions have in place are IRBs, so like institutional review boards. So these review boards, basically what they do is you propose experiments, and then the IRB checks them and tries to make sure that there aren't conflicts of interest or violations of ethical codes or anything like that, and then okays the experiment. So now that experiment can proceed. So if you are doing certain types of things, experiments on animals, experiments on human beings, you have to get IRB approval. That said, Washington clearly points out that many IRBs don't actually have adequate training for their members, right? So you have maybe a diversity of people on the board, but they haven't really been given all that much prep on what to look for, or kind of what the history is in any sort of detail, or they just, haven't been told how to evaluate these cases very clearly. Now, they're probably given a little bit of training, but it's not very effective, especially whenever you consider injecting pregnant women with radioactive iron, right? Or taking advantage of illiterate sharecroppers in Alabama just so that you can inject them with syphilis. These things have huge effects, and they deserve a little bit more training. The other thing that's kind of interesting about IRBs, according to Washington, is that by her research, she kind of found that most IRBs have way too many cases to review, and the members often have conflicts of interest. Okay. So you're basically setting up IRBs for failure if you're giving them so many cases that they don't have the time to consider and read through the details and really subject them to scrutiny like you should. And you're definitely looking for ethical violations if it's the case that professors or, researchers know people who are dealing with the research or have any sort of economic or social interest in what's going on. So if we really want IRBs to be doing their jobs, we need to make sure that they have adequate training. We need to make sure that they don't have too many cases. And we need to make sure that the conflicts of interest are minimized as much as possible. And if not, completely removed, then explicitly stated. She also proposes that there should be equal numbers of scientists or researchers and members of the group that's being studied. So obviously writing a book on Black Americans, if it's a study of Black Americans, you should have Black people on the panel, right? And she says, look, I don't buy that lay people can't understand what's going on. Because whenever you applied for a grant or federal funding, you had to explain that to a non-specialist. Whenever you are making your research known so that you can get press, so that you can, get tenure, whatever else it is, you have to explain that to non-specialists. You should be able to explain this to members of the community. And also by including the community, it should be obvious that that community and their interest in what's going on in that particular experiment, whether or not they're going to clear it, should be able to show how obvious something like injecting Black men with syphilis and not treating them, why that is a bad thing to do, right? So I think that those are really sensible requirements that she gives for something like repairing the process of institutional review boards. It's good that we have IRBs. She's going to agree with that. But she's going to say, if we really take that seriously, we need to make sure that they have these corrections. Second, we need to stop eroding consent. Okay, so if you go to a university-affiliated hospital, a research hospital, sometimes it's the case that people who are admitted unconsciously into the ER are just kind of taken into studies. Okay? Or if you're a soldier, or if you're someone in the third world, as in the Haitian studies, they weren't even told the details of their study, right? They weren't told what's going on. And she's saying, if we really care about voluntary informed consent, we can't make exceptions. What you can do in these cases is you can treat people, but you can't enroll them in a study if they haven't given you explicit consent that they want to participate in that particular study. So again, this is kind of a put your money where your mouth is kind of thing. You say you care about voluntary informed consent, prove it. Stop making all of these exceptions, right? Whether it's being in, a research-affiliated hospital, whether it's taking advantage of soldiers, whether it's taking advantage of people in third world countries. Another thing that she's going to say is make it the case that participants have some sort of mandatory education. All right. So anything in a government-funded research study should have, she's going to say, at least 3 classes, and she kind of breaks it up. 1, there should be a class on the risks and the benefits of different types of research. 2, they should be educated on the legal rights and the moral responsibilities of subjects and basically like how to ask questions. What can you do? How can you leave the study? If something does go wrong, what are your legal rights? And 3, participants should be educated on how they should get the desired result out of the study. So if they are trying to get some sort of treatment or some sort of effect out of the study, they need to be told about what they can do to maximize their chance of getting what they want out of the study, right? So again, this isn't something that is going to come cheap. It's going to take time, but it is also something that plays into that informed element of the voluntary informed consent. Start treating your participants as dignified human beings and make sure that they have the information that they need in order to make informed decisions. And then the last thing is that she's going to say that there should be a unified standard of research ethics. Okay, so there's a lot of different codes, and various hospitals and institutions have their own codes of ethics. And so she recommends trying to unify them as much as possible. And in particular, she's concerned about things like the Haiti experiments, where the US is researching people in other countries, and they're only giving them the standard of care available in that country as opposed to the host institution's country. whether it's economic reasons or practical reasons or whatever else. She says, look, this just isn't acceptable. We should be treating them the same as we would treat them in the US. Okay? Assuming, again, these are American institutions doing this research. And, she doesn't mention, at least in this part, the Declaration of Helsinki, but it is something that we could bring up. And I think she also does something really important here as well, which she says we need to call on the communities themselves to try and set their own research agendas. So if Black Americans are concerned about health outcomes of some sort of thing, what kinds of things would you like to be investigated, right? How would you like to see them investigated? Can we prioritize certain projects over the others? This isn't an easy thing to do, but it is something where you could have community involvement that would actually help the ethical standards to be met. So this is a really large and complicated area of research, and there's a lot out there. You could study this in public health. You could study this in the history or the anthropology of medicine. Any number of ways we could have talked about this. But I hope that all of the experiments that we've talked about today have given a little bit of historical background and context for some of the things that have happened. And I hope that Dr. Angell's advice and Ms. Washington's advice have given us ethical ideas of how to research human beings ethically, right? Voluntary informed consent, and really taking that seriously. Really taking that seriously, making sure that the people who are participating because they want to, and with as much information as possible. And for scientists and physicians, if they are really concerned about doing the most good that they can and avoiding the most harm, they need not only consider the good and the harm of diseases and their treatments, but also the good and the harm of exploiting people and eroding trust in something like the institution of medicine. Those things need to be taken into consideration. You can't just compartmentalize things in a scientific way. You have to look at the overall broad concerns in ethics of experimentation on humans. So thank you so much for your attention. I will see y'all next time.